Welcome back, Blender Heads, to this second chapter of the Character Design for Production tutorial. In this chapter, we're going to start modelling this Suzanne character. Generally speaking, there's two ways that you can go about modelling a character. There is sculpting and there is box modelling. You might be familiar with both of these, but if I just jump over to sculpt mode for a moment, turn on Dyn Topo over here. Make sure we select the right thing. I'm just going to change this to constant detail. I like working with constant detail. And what I'm doing here is just checking the resolution of this sphere, and it's saying that it's about 3.6. So I'm just going to crank that up to about 5. Just doing a little demonstration here. One of the ways of sculpting a character, let's just make sure you want the snake hook brush selected here. You can start off with a primitive object like this, and then you can just sort of come along and you can, start pulling out arms and legs and heads or whatever. And you can kind of flesh out a character from that. This is obviously an absolutely terrible demonstration. That's one way you can go about creating a character. Let's just delete this for a moment. The other way is box modeling, which is, again, you sort of start with a primitive. Let's go with a cylinder in this case. It's got way too many vertices. Let's just drop that down to 12. So let's just say, for example, that you were going to start modeling this guy's chest. Oh, sorry, Suzanne, this girl's chest. You'd come in here and you'd start extruding parts. And bit by bit, you'd box model it. Until you'd built up something, and then you'd go and model the other parts of the body. The benefits to box modeling is that you end up with reasonably good topology as you go along. You get decent edge loops going around and down or whatever. You build the topology as you build the character, which is good in terms of speed because you get both done at the same time. It can be a little bit of a problem when it comes to creativity because getting your topology right is a very technical thing, whereas in making a character look good is a very artistic thing. So sculpting is very, very free-form. You don't have to worry about topology. You just create and move stuff around, and then you worry about the topology later. So it breaks up that artistic and technical stuff. In our case, let's just get that out of the way. In our case, Suzanne's got a little bit of... some parts would be very good for box modeling, some parts are going to be a little bit more difficult, and you're probably better off sculpting. Remember that we're doing this for production, and ultimately our goal is to be able to do this as quickly as possible. So, you could sculpt this whole character from a sphere, but that's probably going to take a little while. So, in our instance, let's just jump to the front view for a moment. I'm just going to go and grab the annotate tool over here. Grab it, thank you. So if we look at Suzanne here, and we go through and break her body down into various different shapes, you can see, her arms are basically just cylinders for the most part. In fact, that blue's kind of difficult to see. I'm just going to go over here, make sure we've got tools. I'm going to change this to something nice and obnoxious. Let's go bright red so you can really see it. Yeah, that's better. Cool. So you can see that her arms are basically just cylinders. And they taper out a little bit at the ends, but that's ultimately just an elongated cylinder. Same deal with her legs. Basically just cylinders with a little bit of tapering. Even her body here is essentially a cylinder shape. Again, with just a little bit of tapering through the middle. Very much an hourglass figure she's got going there. The tail is just a cylinder that's extruded along a curve. Fingers, again, cylinders with a little bit of tapering. the vast majority of this character is just a whole bunch of spheres mashed together, which is really, really useful for box modeling. We can box model all of those things really, really quickly because we just create a whole bunch of cylinders and we extrude along the joints. The head, on the other hand, is much more complicated. To a certain extent, we can still break this down into a kind of oval sort of shape, and then the muzzle's got another overlapping sphere there. The ears are cylinders or spherical shapes. Then you start to get into some nitty-gritty stuff, like the nose is actually kind of a love heart shape. The eyebrows are obviously breaking away from this this oval shape here. And as much as I can look at this and break it down into some simple shapes, I have no idea yet how that topology is going to work. So for doing the head, I kind of want a little bit more creative flexibility, and I don't want to have to worry about my topology yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to box model the body, putting together a whole bunch of cylinders, and we're going to sculpt her head. If you look really closely there, I've still got just this tiny little bit of blue. So I'm just going to quickly go and erase that so we don't end up with little bits floating around. Okay, and I'm moving it again. In fact, let's just go over here. Here's a little tip that you may not have picked up on yet. Underneath here, you've got a whole bunch of toggles. So you can see that it's got the eye and the, whatever that one is, exclude layer. Oh no, that turns all of your layers on and off. And you've got a couple of extra ones that you can turn on. I'm just going to turn on the selectable and make these unselectable. So now it doesn't matter if I touch them, I'm not going to change them. I was extremely tempted when I first started working on this to actually go and use the Suzanne monkey primitive. I played around with it for a little while and started sculpting it, and even when you use Dino Topo and you can completely rejig that underlying topology there, it was just taking forever to get some of these shapes into this kind of shape. So I mean, like that jaw really, hangs down. There's basically no jaw. There's no actual jawline going around the back. So look, it was doable. But then I reminded myself that, hey, this is a tutorial for production purposes, and the whole point of that is to try to do this as fast and as cleanly as possible. So as tempting as this was, I decided not to go with this. So let's just delete that. Now, as we were discussing before, this head shape does have some fairly solid primitives that we can work around. I've gone back to using blue. Hang on a second. Let's just make sure that that's red. So this head does have some fairly nice primitive shapes that we can sort of start from. So what we're going to do is go and create a couple of spheres and such, spheres, cylinders, etc., etc. And then we're going to Boolean those together, and we're going to use that as our base mesh to start from. Now, one of the things that I personally like to do is, this head shape here is very much a sphere, or probably more of an oval shape. So the tempting thing would be to start with an actual sphere. If you just zoom in here, and you're going to go back into edit mode, you can see that we've got all of these edges that are all coming together in the one spot. There we go. Sorry, my keyboard is doing some slightly weird things. So you can see that we've got all of these edges that all come together in this one point. So we've got I don't know how many edges we had here, like 32, and they all come together on this one vertice. Which, if you just go into smooth mode, it's not too bad there. But if you go and apply a smooth subdivision modifier, and hopefully you can see it on this video, hopefully it's high enough quality, but you might just be able to make out these little dark grey lines, or light grey lines, depending on where you're drawing it from, that are coming together here. That's known as pinching. That's what happens when you have far too many edges all converging on the one vertice. So in this case, when we're ultimately going to be applying a Dynamesh to this, and it'll break up the geometry anyway, it's maybe not too big a deal, but generally speaking, I prefer to start with a cube. In fact, before we do that, let's just delete that. You can see we've got the 3D cursor sitting down here. We ultimately want to be working on the head. So I'm just going to drop into front view here, go to view, grab the cursor. I'm just going to move that up a little bit so that anything we create, any new objects that we bring in, are going to be dropped in around about here. And in fact, I can just notice that this front image here is just not quite perfectly centered. That's going to annoy me. So I'm just going to come in here and just shift that along ever so slightly so that it's kind of in the center of our nose. Close enough. Let's turn that off. Now we can't select it anymore. Okay, so as I was saying, we'll create a cube. We add a subdivision modifier to that and go apply. And now you'll notice that if we go into smooth mesh and again apply a new subdivision, you can see that we've lost all of that polling that was happening up the front, all of that creasing. So I personally find this is a bit of a nicer way to get your shapes first worked out. Okay, so let's go into the front view here. I'm going to turn on X-ray mode, which is Alt-Z, and then drop it into edit mode and just start scaling this more the same size, just move it up a little bit. Now I wanted to get this to align to our actual head, not to our eyebrows. So I'm going to scale this in the Z axis and just bring that down till we get to about there, and then scale it out in the X a little bit, maybe up a smidge. Now this isn't going to align perfectly just from resizing this sphere slightly. But before we go and join all of these objects together with a Boolean, I will just come through and do a quick sculpt over, so we'll fix stuff like that over there. Let's just go to the right side and just make sure that this is all working. So scale on the Y axis. And you can see down here, this is obviously not lining up with the back of her head here. Again, that's something that we'll fix before we glue all of these objects together. Okay, so that's an okay shape, at least to start with the head. So now I'm going to go and duplicate, and I'm going to go and create her muzzle. Again, just kind of put that roughly in place. Actually, in this case, you can see that it's sort of coming up at a bit of an angle here, so I'm going to rotate, actually, no, hang on, undo that. Scale it on the Y, and now rotate that. And you can see that kind of fits her jawline just that little bit better. And again, we're not looking for exact shapes here, so you can see this is coming out over the lips here. Don't be too concerned about that just yet. Again, that's something we'll fix when we get to the sculpting stage. I'll just scale that down X and just shift that up a tiny little bit. Let's go to the right side view again. Front view. Okay, that should be pretty close. Now, one thing that I like to add on these sort of characters as we're going is a neck. I found so frequently that when you just have a head and you're just sculpting a head and it doesn't have a neck and maybe even just a little bit of shoulder space, you kind of get this strange floating head thing, and it can really throw off your perception of the character. So I'm just going to quickly go in and add a cylinder. This has got far too many vertices, so let's just drop that down to 12. Go to the right hand side, turn X-ray mode back on, and just scale this down some. Go and slot that into place. Just scale a couple of these things. That's actually probably almost right. I'm going to need another edge loop in here. That's Control R. So that we can scale that neck inwards a little bit. Just get all this to line up. As we kind of did with the jawline there, I might just rotate this a little bit. Actually, here's a little tip. You can see that when I rotate this, it kind of gets smaller along the Z-axis as we're rotating it around. If you want it to maintain its width there, you can use, where is it? It's the shear tool. There we go. Use this. And as we rotate that, you can see that it maintains its width now. I find that very useful. I might just do the same here a little bit. Not so much there, that's probably okay. All right, let's go and look at this from the front view, and you can see that it's just a little bit imperfect. Just needs to be scaled out on the X a little bit. Whoops, that's the Z, X. Sure, that's right. And I'm just going to scale this out quite a bit so that we kind of get that roughly lining up with the shoulders there. Now you're possibly noticing that we're getting a little bit of a gap in between here. Don't worry about that too much. That's something that we'll fix when we come back and sculpt this down and pull it down a little bit. So the next major thing that we really want to get in here is the ears. The ears are obviously, it's a monkey. She's got big floppy ears. Those are kind of important. Similarly, as we had with using the sphere and getting the poles, I found that just using straight cylinders on the ears here can get some strange deformations as well. Again, I'm just going to go and create a cube and subdivide it, apply that. And I'm going to use spheres for her ears instead. Scale that down. Let's just go back into X-ray mode. Let's go bigger rather than smaller, and we can sculpt that into the appropriate shape. Go to the right-hand side. As you can see, this is really not in the right spot. Put it there. It doesn't so much look like it from this angle, but ultimately her ears are going to be a lot flatter than that. So I'm actually going to come in and scale this on the Y, flatten that out considerably, and you can see now that it's no longer lining up to this. That's because this actually needs to be rotated from the top view. So I'm just going to go and create a window over here. Oh, no, that's the wrong menu. Go to the top view, and I really want to turn that shear off for a moment. Let's just selection tool. That's better. Okay, so now as I rotate this, you'll see that it starts to align better in that side view. So I'm just going to pull that around until we get to about there, and then go and stick in that there. Just scaling on the Y just a tiny little bit. Okay, just double check that from the front view. Yeah, we lost quite a bit there, so let's just go scale that on the X, just move it up a little bit. Just make sure that things are still working. You'll notice that from the front view, if I just go and line this up pretty much perfectly to that ear line there, and I go back to the right hand side, you can see that over here it's no longer aligned properly. So this is one of the limitations of trying to convert 2D images to 3D models. Sometimes your front and side views don't match up perfectly, and that's largely because when a 2D artist comes along and draws an ear, like if you look at it from the front view, these are fairly spread out. She's kind of got her ears pushed forward, and if you were to look at that from the side view, they'd largely be a flat line. In the side view, they've kind of been pushed back just that little bit further. That's just something that we're going to have to deal with. I already know that, for example, her eyebrows are going to present us with a slightly similar problem. It's just something that you kind of have to deal with. So we're just going to make this fit as best we can. That's actually not too bad from the side view. Let's go to the front. It's actually not that great. Let's just shift him back over there. Maybe just scale it down just a smidge. Even rotate him a little bit that way. Just go back to the right hand view. Just rotate it that way a little bit. Yeah, see how close we can get this. And I gotta say, that's pretty good. I don't think we're going to get much better than that. Alright, so I'm going to roll with that. Obviously let's just smooth that out so it all kind of looks the same. Obviously that's only one ear, we kind of want a second ear. So let's go over here and add a mirror modifier, and you'll notice, actually let me just join that area back to there, we don't need that anymore. So you'll notice that this mirror modifier has now kind of dumped that ear mirror directly on top of itself. That's because its pivot point, you can see, is right over here, which is not particularly useful to us. That happens when, if you look over here under the transforms, you can see that the location is not set at 0, 0. And the same thing can happen if your rotation is off, or really weird things can happen if your scale is off. So there's two ways we can go about fixing this. We can either go Control A, and we can apply the transforms. In this case, we just need to apply the location. If your rotation and scale was different, you'd just apply all transforms. But let's just go location for now, and you can see that snaps over to the appropriate spot. The downside to this method is now the pivot point is all the way down here. And maybe we, if we were working in the front view and we were looking up here and trying to fine tune something, our pivot point's all the way down here. That could be inconvenient. So I'm just going to undo that. Oops, that was Control A. Control Z. Snap that back over to there. And instead what we can do is use a mirror object. So if I go and click the little eyedropper here and click on the main headpiece, it now uses this object's pivot point as its pivot point to mirror. So you can see that that's fixed our problem, and now our pivot point is over here somewhere, which is kind of nice. Alright, that's enough for the ears for now. You can see that, again, we've got this problem where they're not intersecting, same as we had with the neck down here. That's something where we're going to have to pull this head back a little bit when we just quickly jump into sculpt mode. Okay, so we're very, very close to having this done. There's one last thing that I'm going to put in on this very primitive base mesh, and that's the eyebrows. Often with characters, you won't need to add eyebrows like this, but in our case, these eyebrows are such a prominent part of our monkey character that I'm going to add them manually right at the beginning. Similar deal with what we did with the ears. These are kind of a rounded sort of shape. From the side, they're obviously at a bit of an angle. So again, I'm going to add a cube, I'm going to subdivide it and apply that, and then just go to the front view. Scale that down, turn on X-ray mode again, and just make sure that that's roughly in the right spot. Something like that. And maybe I'll even... Actually, no, let's go to the side view first. Make sure that that's in the right spot. I'm going to scale that on the Z. Scale it up. There we go. Scale it on the Y a little bit. Now I'm going to rotate this back just a little. It doesn't quite need to follow this line here perfectly because ultimately it's getting, buried in the skull there, so it's not so big a deal. From the front, I might just rotate it that way a little. And same as we did before, just smooth that out. Go and add a mirror modifier, and in this case I haven't actually moved the pivot point, so that's roughly in the right spot. Okay, so that should be pretty close to what we want. Okay, so now that we've got all of this sorted, I'm going to go into sculpt mode and start shifting these things around a little bit. So let's start here by jumping into the major part of the skull, because it is kind of the central point to our character. So let's start from the front view, again drop it into X-ray mode. I'm just going to go into sculpt mode, make sure that I've got the grab tool selected, shortcut being G, very similar to edit mode. I'm just going to come in and pull a couple of these little bits and pieces in just a smidge, and I might just pull that down so it connects a little bit better with the muzzle, and pull these head pieces up just a little bit. Jump over to the right side. I'm going to pull this little bit in here. Now, because we're working with something that's really very low poly at the moment, I'm not going to worry about the nose. I'm just going to kind of skip over that for now. Just a little bit more on the chin. Oh, hang on, that's the muzzle. And then we need to pull the back of this skull back a little bit, make sure it's connecting with the neck, like that. Now the part where it didn't connect properly with the ears, this is something we're going to need to address right now. So if you go from the right hand side, you can see that, let's just hide the ears for a second. You can see that this skull, even though the only part that we can see on this sketch kind of stops about here, it would actually go back to somewhere around about here. I mean, we are going to have to guess a little bit exactly where it's got to go. But ultimately, Suzanne here is a primate, which means she's kind of humanoid, and the back of the human skull is rather big. Now, Suzanne's a monkey, so hers probably wouldn't be quite as big, but hey, she's an anthropomorphic monkey, so she's going to be pretty smart. She'll have a fairly big brain sitting in the back of her skull. So I'm just going to pull all of this back here until we get something that I kind of like. And I'm kind of liking that. And now we're penetrating properly with the ears, which is good. I might just move this little central bit back, and that little central bit back a little bit, because that is ultimately going to be a brow ridge. Don't worry too much about getting that perfect just now. Let's go to the front view and just make sure that this muzzle, oops, sculpt mode, this muzzle is fitting. I might just pull this out this way a little bit, because the muzzle here is actually going to kind of flare out into these cheekbones. Just sort of want to try to capture that a little bit early on, because that can be something that causes us a little bit of grief later on. Okay, I'm reasonably happy with where that is. Might do the eyebrows next, just because I know that these can be a little bit of a problem area. Actually, from this direction, that's pretty good. Front view, I'll just pull it up a little bit. Same deal here. You can see that brow ridge kind of goes around the eye socket. Probably this actually needs to be pulled back ever so slightly. Again, once we merge this, it's not going to make too much difference which piece goes where. But I think I'm just going to leave that like that for now. It's a little bit sad, but that's just because of the angle that we've got here. Go to the ears and just make sure that these roughly match. Right hand side, back quite a bit. Out, pull that down. I'm just going to go and hide that for a second so that I can see this line a little bit easier. Pull that into place. And I think we're pretty close. Let's just unhide that and let's just make sure that everything is connecting in a way that we like. There's no holes anywhere. And I think I'm happy with that shape. One last little check over. Okay, I think I'm ready to glue these together. So I'm going to go over to the edit mode, and you can see we've got our Bool tools open here. Now you may not have that on by default. That's an add-on. So just go into your add-ons menu and just go Bool, and you've got Bool tools, which you can switch on and off. So this makes gluing objects together really easy. Now before I jump in, I'm just going to go through and apply these mirror modifiers, particularly the ones that have the mirror object as this cube, well, quote-unquote cube, this headpiece here, because, let me just demonstrate, if I go and grab those two and I go union, you can see that it breaks the ears because it no longer, when it combines these objects, it creates an entirely new object, which can break these, because it no longer knows what it's referencing. So I'm just going to apply that, and everything else should be okay. All right, so we grab those. We want to use the union. This is the one that cuts out anything that's intersecting. The other ones will cut parts of your object out. Actually, let's just demonstration. So difference there, cuts a hole in, intersect, leaves the parts that are actually intersecting. So we want to use union. Glue all of these bits together. That seems to have shifted slightly as we've glued them. Just make sure that doesn't happen, and let's just pull that down a little bit. Make sure that it continues to stay connected. Watch out for that. That hasn't happened to me before. We've got a little bit happening over this side too. Is this broken symmetry? Oh yes, this broke symmetry at some point. Okay. Occasionally that might happen. Because we've done Booleans, it's kind of made up its own geometry underneath, and you can see that it doesn't match perfectly. You can see those two vertices there are not exactly the same as like those three there. Just ignore that for a moment. I will show you how we can fix that. That wasn't meant to happen, but that's actually a good little accident because now I can show you how to fix it. I'll just make sure that this is reasonably symmetrical. And reasonably is good enough. Considering we're going to dyno topo this, this kind of symmetry is close enough. In fact, I'm messing around with this. I should just go symmetry is in fact turned on, which means that this geometry is just so different that it can't quite figure out what to do. So let's just finish gluing these bits together. Sorry, it's under Edit, Union. Okay, now we've got all of these bits glued together. So there's two things we need to check. We need to make sure that our symmetry is in fact working, because that will become important once we really start getting into the sculpting. Oh, and okay, it seems to have, for the most part, fixed itself. Okay. Look, I might still show you how I would have fixed that if it hadn't broken. But before we jump onto that, let me just... When you do Booleans like this, sometimes the geometry can go a little bit funky. So one thing we're going to do before we finish up this lesson is I'm actually going to zoom inside Suzanne's head here. And I might just go and change this to flat shaded mode, just so we can see the polygons a little bit easier. And you can see what I'm looking at here is actually her ear hole. I just zoom out here, you can see there's where the ear intersects, and you can see we're now looking on the inside of her ear. What we want is for these objects to be hollow just like this, so that we can spin around. It's a little bit cumbersome inside of her head. There's the other ear hole. We spin around here, we can see the eye holes. And what we're looking for here is occasionally you'll get a little mistake. That one's actually not too bad. Occasionally, what you'll get is if we were to just take these edge loops around the ear hole, that as close as possible. That's we're missing one there. Occasionally, this ear used to be a sphere shape, so it actually used to come inside the head, and when we did the union, it cut all of this out. Sometimes it doesn't do that union perfectly, and you'll end up with a scenario like this. That's really bad, because now we have these strange intersecting geometry where we've got vertices on the inside and the outside, and when we go to sculpt this, it just goes bad. It goes really, really bad. So we just wanted to do a quick check on the inside of the head there, to make sure that everything is working, and it looks like it is. Let me just quickly show you how I would, if symmetry had continued to break here, let me just show you how I would have fixed this. Dyn Topo down here has some really cool extra features. So I'm just going to go and turn Dyn Topo on. You want to make sure that you've got whichever axes you want to symmetrize on. That's what we're going to do here. We're going to symmetrize. So in this case, we're going from the negative x over this side to the positive x. And in our case, it doesn't matter too much which way we go, because it's all so very, very basic. But if we just go down here and go symmetrize, particularly watch the eyes around here, you can see there's some subtle differences. You'll be able to go symmetrize, and bang! All of a sudden, we've got a perfectly symmetrical model. Alright, so we're going to leave it there. We now have our base mesh prepared, and in the next lesson we're going to come in and go back into Dyn Topo, and we're going to start fleshing out this shape a little bit more. I'll see you then.